Welcome back, everybody. It is another episode of the Decline and Fall Show, this week brought to you by the Hinduja Brothers, our proud sponsor of this week's program. And if you get that reference, it means you were around in the very late 1990s, when what can only be described as Nightmare on Epstein Island 1 was released, which was the first time that the illustrious, now Lord Mandelson, was in trouble for trying to obtain a British passport for some very rich Indian oligarchs. He followed this up with Nightmare on Epstein Island 2, where he had to resign from the cabinet a second time a few years later, and then went on to pursue a very illustrious career in expenses fiddling for the European Commission, before finally, of course, landing his true and proper place as an ambassador to the United States of America. Now, currently, with that particular sequel having been released and bombed in cinemas, the future of the franchise has been called into question. I am, of course, referring to the fate of a certain Lord Mandelson, whom we will talk about in greater detail later on in the program. But Kit, are you surprised then that with the career of Mandelson being an apparently unkillable paedophile-affiliated corrupt bastard, that Britain has got itself the deserved title of Paedophile Island? Is that a title that, in your view, is well deserved?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that Mandelson exemplifies that particular tendency of the British ruling class. I made a sideways reference yesterday to the fact that yesterday being September 11th, given that Mandelson was sacked due to his Epstein affiliations in the wake of in the wake of Charlie Kirk's shooting, that it was a good day to bury bad news. Now, not everyone got the reference. Some people did, and for that I applaud you. Although it's a demonstration that we're all getting older. In that phrase, "good day to bury bad news," its origins came from, there was a British government advisor called Joanna Moore, who on September 11th, in an internal email, said this is a great day to bury anything negative. To do, while people's attention is distracted, and she subsequently issued a very public apology and then disappeared from politics altogether. But that was the kind of spin mentality that Mandelson really helped cement at the core of the British government, and that legacy endures today. So it is rather fitting that yes, he has been sacked yet again. And indeed, this fell on September the 11th, such a symbolic, historic date. But there's been an enormous, on top of Charlie Kirk's assassination, which we will get into in detail. There's been an enormous amount of upheaval in recent days and weeks, Alex. Why don't we hop into it?
Well, let's then start with the events in Kathmandu, Nepal, where recently what has been described in the imperialist media as a Gen Z uprising has taken place, particularly in Kathmandu. Now, what this refers to is a series of riots that took place in the capital of Nepal, Kathmandu, over the course of the last week, which concluded with the resignation of the Nepali Prime Minister, a man named KP Oli. And this was after these riots, which claimed the lives of at least 19 people, saw various government buildings burnt down, and were accompanied with, shall we say, English language printed slogans, which will be familiar to anybody who's followed the history of colour revolutions everywhere across the world, going back to the days of the overthrow of Milosevic, which is the same very well distributed and perfectly printed English language slogans appear amongst crowds of protesters, largely drawn from disillusioned urban petty bourgeois youth, and linked to, of course, dozens of overseas, principally British, American, and European foundations and NGOs, which have their claws into the countries concerned. Now, I want to just take a moment to remind the audience, in case you weren't paying attention to our earlier series, particularly on Yugoslavia, in which case, do go back and watch those. But just to remind everybody of the role that the NGO system plays. The NGO system is one of the most effective means of neo-colonial management that has emerged really since the 60s, but really took off, of course, since the 80s and the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And what these do is that these effectively, whilst being at arm's length from various different imperialist governments, these act as their agents in exercising influence inside foreign countries. We've talked before about Georgia and the hundreds of European and American NGOs that operate there. And what they do is, when a imperialist power wants to exercise influence, what they do is they press upon a government and say that they have concerns over particular areas and that they can offer solutions to these concerns in the form of basically the government's concerns, such as Nepal, giving the right to operate to NGOs, arm's length organizations from the imperialist countries, who then move in and run different projects which are designed to do two things. First of all, gather intelligence on the local population and the country. Second of all, to recruit people to essentially act as the witting or unwitting foot soldiers of the imperialist power via the cultural influencing operations, via the spreading around of, shall we say, imperialist largesse. This is what happened in Armenia, which gave us the wretched little cretin known as Nikol Pashinyan. And so when you have a very poor country with a relatively high amount of unemployment, suddenly injecting large amounts of money from these massive foundations, NGOs, government, pseudo-government entities into that country will create a whole class of people who come to be reliant upon it and who can be reliably mobilized as foot soldiers when the imperialist powers require it to be so. Now, this is part of the story in Nepal. Now, I'll just give the audience a bit of historical background. Nepal, of course, was for a long time dominated by the British. It was nominally an independent country, but has supplied the British Empire with soldiers known as Gurkhas for many, many decades now. And they became some of the most reliable and brutal parts of the British Army as a result. US aid, the notorious USAID, has been in Nepal consistently since 1951. So even when the British departed formally from the region, the Anglo-Americans retained a very heavy bootprint in Nepal with the activities of USAID and others. Now, there was a decade-long revolutionary war in Nepal waged by Maoist Communist Party, which concluded in 2006 with the dissolution of the Nepali monarchy following the attempt at a coup by the last king, Gyanendra, who, by the way, was rumored to be behind the assassination of his entire family in a bid to seize the throne for himself, but that's a story for another day. But the 2006 agreement to dissolve the monarchy and put in place a parliamentary republic, a constitutional republic, was one that needs to be understood properly. This wasn't a revolution in the sense that China had, or the Soviet Union had, or the old Yugoslavia had, or Albania had. This was an agreement between the existing Nepali ruling class and the various different oppositional forces, which included the Maoists who came into the political process. But it wasn't a socialist revolution. It was, at best, a bourgeois democratic reform. The old state structure of Nepal, one that has long been dominated by the Americans, the British, and others, remained in place. The old civil service structure, the old state bureaucracy, and the arrangements with US aid, other US, British, and European NGOs, and also something called the Nitti Foundation, who play a big role here. Now, the Nitti Foundation are linked to our old friend and frequent guest on this show in virtual form, a certain George Soros, who has financial links to them. The Nitti Foundation, even according to bourgeois media reports, had people in almost every single Nepali government ministry since 2006. And one of the defining features of Nepal since 2006 has been political instability. The governments, nominally often headed by one of the communist parties, come in and then fall apart within about 18 months. What's constant is the presence of US aid, the presence of the Niti Foundation and others, not just outside there in what's called civil society, but directly in government offices, bringing with them people like Deloitte and other management consultancies which are directly linked to intelligence services across Britain and the United States. If you've worked in the British civil service, as I have, Deloitte's name is all over various different contracts that both internal and external within the British government, along with other big accountancy and management consultancy firms like KPMG, McKinsey in the United States and others, all of which are integrated completely into intelligence operations. So Nepal found itself in a situation where it had the worst of all possible worlds. Outside of the government, various different NGOs were exercising influence over disillusioned, unemployed youth. Remember, Nepal has an unemployment rate amongst the youth of 22% at least. And inside the government, loads of different projects, including the new constitution, including agricultural projects, including the design of a new healthcare system. All of this was enmeshed in the tentacles of USAID, the Niti Foundation, and various other different things. So when people say, oh, the Nepali government hasn't worked, the question has to be raised, who was running the Nepali government? Because if a prime minister lasts about 18 months, he's not running it. Those who are there for years run it, meaning USAID, meaning various different things connected to the US, including like Niti Foundation, Soros Foundations, and others. So the Nepali communist parties are caught between two halves of a bear trap, basically. On the one hand, you have a permanent bureaucracy which is dominated by imperialist interests and always has been, going all the way back to the 1950s, which the removal of the monarchy didn't do anything to uproot that. And on the other hand, you have disillusioned youth getting all their ideas from this same group. So this is what happens when this is the classic setup for a color revolution, because you have, on the one hand, the imperialists creating the problems, and on the other hand, the same imperialists hiding behind a different set of names saying they'll solve the problems if you get rid of this government that has displeased us in some way. In this case, it was because the government was moving closer to things like the Belt and Road Initiative and signing more deals with the Chinese. That's when somebody decided to pull the trigger. And because of the still large influence of the imperialists in Nepal, there was plenty of, shall we say, fuel for the fire. They just needed to spark it. And the spark came nominally because of the government's bill to actually regulate the presence of foreign social media networks in the country. But that's not really what any of this was about. So what you're seeing in Nepal is a classic color revolution operation. But to reiterate the point, in every single one of these operations, what always happens is a government tries to make concessions to the imperialists by inviting the NGO complex in. The NGO complex promptly fucks up the country, and then there's an uprising which, because civil society, as it's called, is dominated by basically fake imperialist-run organizations, you end up with an uprising which only benefits, guess who? The same interested parties in the West. Kit, I'll now throw to you for your analysis of the situation.
Well, I mean, number one, you summed up the wider milieu here very eloquently and succinctly, my friend. In your typical style. But yes, I think that a post on the Nepalese quote unquote revolution that caught my eye was from the mighty Arnaud Bertrand. He's someone I greatly respect and have a personal affinity for. We're hoping to get him on the show. I find most of his analysis very spot on. He was skeptical of the idea that this is a color revolution because, due to a variety of factors, such as Nepal being geographically, I mean, it's landlocked. It is such as its position between India and China. It is completely dependent on those countries for imports of essential goods. and China or India, and India has done this several times, can just shut off the flow at any time and cause very serious problems locally. And he questioned what interest the Anglo-Americans might have in triggering a palace coup in Nepal. Now, I respectfully, I can understand where he's coming from, and as someone who's actually lived there, I do think that his views are certainly worthy of consideration. But now I very respectfully disagree, because, I mean, number one, if we look at the wider picture here, India and the US, to say the least, their relationship is in the doldrums at the moment, and US policymakers have basically admitted that they messed up big time and have pushed India into the arms of China and Russia. Okay, so that's point one to bear in mind. Point two, we've now had, since, I believe, I forget when Khan was couped at US, was that 2002 or 2003?
Or in Pakistan?
Yes, when Imran Khan was removed from
2022.
Yes, in 2022. So since and that was due to his aggressive neutrality, the US was not happy about. Now, so we've had that coup. At the end of last year, we had the coup in Bangladesh, which, as I and my friend and colleague Wyatt Reed exposed based on leaked documents, was wholly orchestrated by the National Endowment for Democracy. And so I think this is about encircling, and bearing in mind that the ousted Bangladeshi leader, who has fled into hiding under threat of execution, she stated that Sheikh Hasina, she said that the US had been pressuring Bangladesh to allow for the construction of a massive military base in its territory, and she had opposed this, and the US was, to say the least, very unhappy about it. So, she's gone 6 months after she reveals this publicly. And so we now have a situation where India, at a time that the US views it basically as an enemy, and is extremely frustrated that India has not gone along with anti-Russian sanctions, that it has not caved to threats of tariffs in order to apply secondary sanctions to Russia. That is absolutely ripe for creating a problem on India's border. A historical analogy might be the 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, where Georgia is a tiny country on Russia's doorstep, and the explicit purpose of trying to integrate Georgia into NATO and effectively creating this perfect Western puppet state was to create this permanent source of agitation for Russia on its border. Georgia also served as a key jumping off point for CIA-sponsored Chechen militants into Russia. So, I think that the grounds for the US and the British would have every interest in removing the Nepalese government for a start. But something that really caught my eye when I was just going over my kind of archive of leaks. And I recently reported on for Grey Zone. Sorry, again, it would not be a Decline in Full without a shameless plug or two. I recently reported for the Grey Zone on the activities of BBC Media Action. Now, this is the alleged charitable wing of the British state broadcaster, but the leaks that I reported on show that it is involved in nakedly political work overseas on the Foreign Office's dime, It creates factual, quote unquote, and entertainment programming to achieve, quote unquote, behavioral change and an attitudinal change and social change in target countries. It, for instance, produced a drama series in West Africa, which was viewed by tens of millions of people. And BBC Media Action's internal polling found that 40% of people who viewed the show, according to their polling, voted differently as a result. Now, this work was conducted in the lead up to Nigeria's 2015 election, which saw a pro-Western outsider seize power, and he's driven the country into the ground ever since. Just immiserating and impoverishing, and an already kind of thoroughly colonized and enfeebled local population. Now, the wider point is BBC Media Action, while it works all over the world and it piggybacks off the footprint of BBC World Service, which is active in pretty much every corner of the globe, it has 15. BBC Media Action has just 15 dedicated country offices. It has a dedicated office in Nepal. So, we have this British state-funded information warfare operation, which is specifically concerned with influencing people's behavior and perceptions in ways that befit Britain's interests. And it, for some reason, decided to set up shop specifically in the forbidding earthquake-prone wilds of Nepal. Why? If there was no greater interest or kind of payback, as it were, kind of return on investment for the British, why would they do that? And so I think that in itself is very interesting, that Nepal is one of just 15 dedicated offices that BBC Media Action operates. Now, on top of this, you've also got to bear in mind that, as I've again written about, like in recent months, the National Endowment for Democracy, it has removed its grant database from the web. So we don't know what groups it is funding, if any, in Nepal. That information is no longer accessible. However, when you go onto the website of Hami Nepal, which is the youth group at the forefront of the Nepalese upheaval, and I might add that it is an absolutely standard color revolution tactic. We saw it in Georgia, we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Yugoslavia, we've seen it in Lebanon, we've seen it in Hong Kong, we've seen it everywhere. It is a standard color revolution tactic to have a youth group as the face of the revolution. Now, if you if you go down to the bottom of Hami Nepal's website, their list of funders is very interesting. They are sponsored by the Ambassador Hotel's Nepalese branch. They are sponsored by Coca-Cola. They are sponsored by a Viber, which is a popular messaging app in some parts of the world. They are sponsored by Al Jazeera as well, which seems very strange. And they're also sponsored by Students for a Free Tibet, which, according to archived records for NED financing in Hong Kong, is getting a lot of money from NED. Now, that in itself is, you might say, is potentially not a killer blow or smoking gun. But the fact is why is a student protest group getting funded by Coca-Cola?
What possible info like in the US is for a sweet taste of corn syrup?
Yeah. And it's just like, if you go down to the very bottom of their landing page, they specifically say brands that support us. Now, funnily enough, the very first NED sponsored youth group in Yugoslavia, the Anti-Milosevic Otpor, They explicitly stated that they looked to corporate branding for inspiration in their anti-government agitation, and they took Coca-Cola as a model. And they specifically said the revolution needs a marketing department. Well, from the looks of things, Hami Nepal has quite the well-funded marketing department behind them. And there is a wide variety of Western corporations who, for some reason, are really interested in improving a lot of young people in Nepal. It seems, which is yes, deeply, deeply, deeply strange. I might add as well that excuse me, that a key supporter of Hami Nepal, not listed on their website, is this local oligarch called Deepak Bhatta. He is a gun runner who has been behind the training and arming of the Nepalese police and military in deeply corrupt deals where the Nepalese government paid 4 times the unit price for various weaponry that he sourced. Very controversial deal. Now, there is that great line in Hector Gabras's legendary film Z about the fascist coup in Greece, where a CIA agent says, "Why do you think we train the police? They're not up for election every 4 years." So, I mean, again, funnily enough, Hami Nepal is sponsored by the Gurkha Veterans Trust. The Gurkhas were and remain an absolutely formidable fighting force, routinely exploited by the British, and frequently deployed in secret wars, kind of that Britain fought off books in countries like Vietnam in the aftermath of World War II. So the having the birthplace of the deadly Gurkhas on India's doorstep, at a time when India is in the West's bad books. I mean, what could be better than that? From the perspective of the Anglo-American Empire, because again, they potentially have a large number of foot soldiers who are willing to do the fighting and dying for them, and if not spark outright war, at least create a thorn in the Indian government's side. And potentially, knock it back into line. I personally don't think that's particularly realistic at this point, because I think that what we've been seeing recently, particularly with the SCO conference, is that a large number of countries, including countries that have historically either been wary of China or have been reluctant to fully throw their lot in with Beijing and BRICS, because they have or at least there are elements of their societies or political class who view the West as a potential ally, and they don't want to burn that bridge. It's gotten to the point where a lot of countries are intensely relaxed about burning bridges with the West.
Well, this is, of course, another cautionary tale here of what happens when you allow your country to be absolutely infested with NGOs. Because this is part of what happens when, as you were saying about the BBC's influencing operation in places like Nigeria, when you allow like all of the ideological terms inside your society to be set by hostile foreign states, or foreign states that seek to control you, then what you do is you set up a situation where when there are domestic problems, the very terms under which like any domestic political, shall we say, trouble is conducted are those which are decided by the imperialist powers. So you have like all these the Gen Z protests, etc., like getting all their slogans, getting all their organizational practices from BBC, from Al Jazeera, which, lest we forget, Al Jazeera was founded by former members of the BBC's Arabic service, if I remember it correctly. And so you allow all of the terms of protest to be decided by external actors. And I would say that the British definitely have an interest, as do the United States, in creating problems on the borders of both China and India. So you can, if you can win Nepal over to be run by, say, monarchists again, or ultra reactionaries, or it can be just reduced to a chaotic state, which is a source of permanent instability. Well, that's a win. It doesn't matter if there's no stable government there. It doesn't matter if it just dissolves into violence and madness. Good from the perspective of the imperialists, because it just creates more problems for adversaries and potential adversaries. Now, ideally, they would like a stable puppet state, but if they can't get a stable puppet state, then they'll have Syria, of which more later, or they'll have Libya. So this is what you have to bear in mind at all times, that when the best thing you can do if you're any kind of government that wants to actually develop your country is to boot out all of the Western NGOs, is to not fall for the nonsense talked by these people about development or, microfinancing or any of the other scams that they want to run. Because all you're doing is basically allowing them to build a weapon which they will use against you whenever they feel the need. And it might not even be that the Nepali government had done something particularly offensive to the imperialist powers. It just, world events turned in such a way as to need to activate another front against the Chinese or something, or deny the Chinese the opportunity of working with the Nepali government, because ever since the fall of the monarchy, despite some progress in targeting absolute poverty, Nepal remains underdeveloped, a pre-industrial country in most of the places in Nepal. Only really Kathmandu has any real development, and a large dependence upon mass migration out of the country and the sending back of remittances, because there's no developed industrial economy whereby, like this, the youth unemployment can be resolved by training and deploying people to new industries. The Chinese investment can help to bring that in various places in the world. So the imperialists don't want Nepal to develop. They want it to be a source of Gurkhas who can join the British Army to be the tip of the spear, so to speak, and to be a place which can be easily dominated by them. They don't want these countries to develop. No matter what they say in language and sort of the guff pumped out by their NGO complex. So a situation which we'll need to keep an eye on depending upon how it goes. But I think now it requires us to turn to the Freddy Krueger of British politics. And again, that is a title which is hotly contested for various different reasons. But I refer, of course, to a certain Lord Mandelson, who has been sacked as a U.S. ambassador, as a British ambassador to the United States, who prior to this was Northern Ireland Secretary. He was DTI Secretary for a while. He was a European Commissioner, and corruption followed him everywhere he went. Also a man who liked to frequent the yachts and the private islands of the oligarchies of the world. And that, of course, led him into the company of a certain Mr. Jeffrey Epstein. And he was photographed. Quite who took those photographs, I would like to know, because that would be curious, whether it was Ghislaine Maxwell or somebody else. But Mandelson was photographed with Epstein in various different locations 10 to 15 years ago, both before and after he received his initial conviction for committing sexual acts with underage girls, and also for trafficking girls for the purposes of, shall we say, the sexual degeneracy of the American and British elites. And yet, Mandelson, despite these ties, despite having been so corrupt that he was forced out of government twice, despite all of this, Keir Starmer saw fit to appoint him to one of the most prized jobs in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is, of course, Ambassador to the United States. Now, it has been coming out in the British media across the course of the last week that Starmer was warned that Mandelson was a security risk, due to his association with Epstein and, shall we say, certain peccadillos that Mandelson displayed, which, shall we say, are typical of a certain class of politician in the imperial core nations. And we'll leave it there for now. So, a security risk, a man who'd had to resign twice for corruption, a man who was notorious for being attracted towards money and was willing to basically do anything to get more money for himself. A job that he was appointed to, which could have gone to any number of less openly corrupt officials. So the question remains, with all of this being known, when the security services in Britain had to know, and indeed do know, far more about Mandelson's associations with Epstein, and had to have had on the files the damaging information that could have been given to Starmer, and it must be asked, was it given to Starmer? Why, despite all of that, does Keir Starmer appoint him as ambassador to the United States, knowing the very heavy amount of political damage it could do if more revelations came out, which they now have? So, Kit, Mandelson booted, but the question has to be asked, why on earth did Starmer, knowing all of this, appoint him in the first place?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that the Mandelson's relationship with Epstein was very, very, very well known, and I think that there is an element of the establishment wanting to throw Mandelson under the bus again. He's probably done something to piss someone off, because Robert Peston, of all people, the client journalist has on Twitter published 10 pages of Mandelson's 2003 birthday message to Epstein, and it is worth going through. The level of affection and reverence that reserved for the serial paedophile and likely CIA and Mossad asset Epstein by Mandelson is quite extraordinary. I won't read it in full because it's quite sickening, but it starts off by saying, once upon a time, an intelligent, sharp-witted man they call Mysterious parachuted into my life. And there's an accompanying photo of a parachute, perhaps with Epstein on it. And yes, I would spend many hours just waiting for him to turn up. And it goes on and on and on. I do think it's worth reading in full. There is this very bizarre entry where Mandelson refers to leaving Epstein with some quote unquote interesting friends to entertain. One of them appears to be a rather young girl wearing a mask. It's deeply, deeply, deeply creepy. But yeah, this was well known. So the question does arise, well, what dirt does Mandelson have on people to get this to get this post in the first place? Number two, I think that it speaks to Blair's enduring influence over Starmer. I think that Blair said that he rings him every day. Whether Starmer answers is a different question. He might be tied up quite literally with other matters. Something that really caught my eye as well was in July this year, the Mail on Sunday exposed how Intermediate, which I think we've discussed, is this very dodgy MI6 linked firm that claims to be involved in conflict resolution and was pitching its services to Hillary Clinton from the earliest days of the Syrian crisis, claiming that it could be a mediator for armed groups in Syria to take power. But the year before HTS did seize power in Damascus by brute force, intermediate approach senior US officials stating that they were helping rebrand HTS from terrorists to politicians, and Intermediate now has a office in the Syrian presidential palace. Now, this was broken by all sources or by the Mail on Sunday. Now, there was a very interesting accompanying editorial which stated that Jonathan Powell and Peter Mandelson are the real forces in quote-unquote British diplomacy, which is to say overt and covert skullduggery abroad, defense and foreign policy, and Foreign Secretary David Lammy has been reduced to an effectively ceremonial role. I think that speaks to the fact that, yes, that that Blair is effectively still in control, or his minions and their respective private networks are actually the ones running things in Starmer's government. Now, it has been reported that Powell he was a key Iraq war architect and was the individual responsible for the wording of a intelligence assessment being changed to make it sound like Saddam Hussein was able to attack Britain with chemical weapons within 45 minutes, which was a total lie, but was a core component of the US case for the illegal 2003 invasion. There have been mainstream profiles of Powell that state that he has absolutely no regrets about Iraq and would do it again, and still believes in humanitarian interventionism, which is, a very Blairite idea. Interestingly, Powell took up his role as Starmer's national security advisor the day I think it was 2 or 3 days before HTS seized power in Syria, and then immediately Starmer said that the fall of Assad means a greater role for Britain in West Asia. Which was quite an interesting response to a prescribed terrorist group seizing power via force. It's very, very murky. I strongly suspect that Mandelson is still seen by Blair and by extension Starmer and people around him, or at least was before this became his relationship with Epstein became a real scandal, was seen as a wise operator who could push both the British government but also the American government in the quote unquote right directions. Blair was very big on attempting to bounce the Americans into doing his bidding, and he tried to do it as we discussed in our Yugoslavia special. He tried to get the US to invade Yugoslavia on Britain's behalf. He was very, very, very supportive of the war on terror, and had a series of correspondence with George Bush in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, in which he encouraged Bush to exploit maximum global sympathy for the US to launch a wave of military interventions across West Asia, which came to pass. Perhaps Mandelson's seedy criminal past was looked past by token of his proximity to Blair and his past experience of manipulating or exploiting the Americans to further British interests. There is also potentially as well another slightly more personal aspect to this, which is what's rather forgotten is that Mandelson was a very, very key figure in the Remain movement. And we now know, it has been confirmed, that Starmer remained in the shadow cabinet specifically in order to push Corbyn towards a Remain position, or at least a second referendum position. And it was known that this was going to completely sabotage their Labour's electoral chances in 2019, which it did. And Mandelson didn't even campaign during the election, while also consulting with firms on how to deal with the regulatory impact of Brexit. What a murky, what a deadly web we weave when we practice to deceive. And Mandelson has his entire life has been typified by lying and manipulation.
Well, farewell, Peter Mandelson. I'm sure you'll be back at some point soon with another job, maybe leader of the House of Lords or something like that. Because it would seem that the enduring influence of men like Blair in particular and the circle around him, which very much includes Mandelson and includes people like Alistair Campbell, these people are still very important when it comes to actually understanding the political system in Britain, unfortunately. And I think one of the reasons why is because they were sort of the last generation of politicians that were seen by the ruling class themselves as being nominally at least successful. They presided over like the period ending in 2007, 2008, which still saw like Britain having like at least on paper economic growth, maintaining like an important place in the world, benefiting hugely from the invasion and destruction of Iraq, and before, of course, the economic crisis, which they conveniently blame on old Gordon Brown, despite the fact, of course, that he is very much partly to blame for it, but Blair escaped blame for that. So I think part of it is because they were seen as being a big success. And that because people like Keir Starmer are so incredibly shallow and incredibly stupid, he will always take a call from Blair because it is a sort of a maxim for all of these people inside the Labour Party that Blair is the big success. Blair knows how to get victories. Blair is taken seriously by various different foreign actors and can open doors for people. The true story of Tony Blair and his various intersecting business interests would be a very interesting special for us one day, and one perhaps that we should return to. This, of course, leads us into further discussion regarding the future trajectory of American policy, which, of course, the likes of Blair and Powell have a direct interest in. Now, recently, there's been all kinds of, shall we say, speculation as to where American defense policy is going. And the most recent defense review inside the Pentagon, carried out by the Undersecretary of Defense, or I suppose it's Undersecretary of War now, for Policy, Eldridge Colby, has been subject to a lot of reporting recently. Now, what seems to be the objective of this review, according to various different media outlets that have covered it, is that the United States, or particularly, shall we say, a certain faction within the Trump administration, is looking to move away from direct management of at least the war in Ukraine, and according to reporting on this defense review, focus on domestic and hemispheric threats. Now, it should be said that this is merely the work of one particular faction in the Trump administration, but it seems to be one that has at least some influence over the president himself. That Trump and Hegseth and others have been trying to do when it comes to Ukraine is to essentially ride two horses at once. They've been trying to get out of the war directly themselves by claiming that they're going to give it to the Europeans to manage, and that Ukraine can be sustained via purchases of weaponry from the United States carried out by Europe. And all of that, by the way, is completely speculative on their part, and also is probably going to prove to be a complete folly, given that Europe can't buy what the US doesn't have, and also that Ukraine is running out of men. But it's a cover that Trump is trying to use to essentially paper over the fact that he is, as the Biden administration would have had to in the end, slowly backing away from the mess that they've made in Ukraine and hoping that nobody notices this disaster. So what this defense review seems to be tilting towards is trying to go in two different directions at once. One saying they want to shift towards hemispheric threats, meaning that what they want to do is to essentially use U.S. military power and sanctions to try and subjugate nations like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and possibly Mexico, who dare to step out of line or away from U.S. interests. But also, they are still trying to suggest that they can contain or take on China in some way. despite the fact that even this defense review appears to admit that they've got very little chance of doing so. So it's a strange and contradictory document that's been written. Whether, of course, it goes into policy action is another question, but it does show that there is a very much a divided mentality, or there is a divided administration between those who still wish to continue in the projecting US power into as many different corners of the world as possible, and those who, for their own reasons, believe that they need to shift towards a more local domination rather than global. Kit, what was your response to the reporting around this, and what do you think is in play in terms of the defense review and the role that the Colby faction is playing in the Trump administration?
Well, it's very interesting because yes, Colby wrote an entire book not long ago, on what he called the strategy of denial, which was about trying to deny China's inexorable rise economically, politically, and in every other field that matters, and we see how well that's worked out, since. So, I mean, I actually am kind of unsurprised by this alleged shift to, this purported shift to a focus on the Western Hemisphere, because number one, it is, as a great many analysts, including people like Lawrence Wilkerson, who was he was an advisor to Colin Powell. He has openly stated that when he was, and this was when when he was Powell's advisor, and this was when the US was a lot more powerful than it is today, to put it mildly, that they ran numerous war games against China then. And within days, the US had lost and they had to go nuclear. So, I think it's kind of this reflects the fact that reality has potentially finally caught up with US planners, that actually that they would be unable to match China in a military confrontation. So, in that context, you're going to shift away from a military build-up in that region because you don't have the money or the resources or the people to do so, and you're going to lose anyway, even if you do this. And all the more reason you might overthrow the government of Nepal. Just to create chaos and headaches for your adversary on their border. But I actually think that this kind of call it retrenchment and refocusing on America's quote unquote backyard, to use this disgusting but very common parlance applied to the Americas by Washington. This was telegraphed a very, very long time ago. Now, I wrote about this at the time. In December 2024, there was James Foley, who was the US ambassador to Haiti in the early 2000s when there was the CIA coup that removed Aristide from power and contributed to Haiti's descent into this nightmarish gangland that it is today, where there is no functioning state and rival armed factions just fight it out and whatnot, while UN quote unquote peacekeepers just trundle around doing not very much at all. He specifically stated that, we should be in this op-ed for the rabidly anti-communist Miami Times. Foley specifically said, we should be focusing on points of instability in Latin America. And with Haiti at the forefront of this. Now, I might add that the US has self-authored legal justification already for intervening in this in the region, which was actually part. This was a law that was passed under Trump. It's called the Global Fragility Act, and it specifically states that its ostensible objectives are to prevent violent conflict and instability in countries where the US has national security interests, and it means that they can, whenever they like, it's kind of similar to the Monroe Doctrine, just intervene in the Americas. We discussed last week the rather embarrassing flailing of the Trump administration in and around Venezuela. There are softer targets in the region which the US could focus on. Yes, I mean, as in recent years, there has been a leftward shift in much of the region. Colombia in 2019, we saw Evo Morales removed from power in a CIA-orchestrated fascist coup, and then thankfully his MAS Socialist Party was re-elected 2 years later. But the point is I think that the US is probably at this stage only able to flex its muscles locally, and even then against countries that aren't threats. So I mean, we have had the attempt to build up Venezuela as this center of drug trafficking, and Maduro as some Scarface style kingpin. Under the Global Fragility Act, they could go anywhere. They can arbitrarily designate any country they wish in the Western Hemisphere as we're going to deploy troops here because instability, because reasons. I think that this has been a long time coming. It does reflect the fact that the US is pulling away from Europe and the Middle East to an extent. It's somewhat unsurprising. Although, I mean, you should never underestimate the enduring delusions of the blob. And I'm sure that there remain, many hawkish elements of the US power structure who still think that conflict with China might be plausible. Although by the same token, I think that given the scale of the defeat in Ukraine, which is obvious to anyone who isn't in a state of conscious and deliberate denial. I strongly suspect that the plot to use Taiwan as a beachhead for war with China, just as Ukraine was meant to be a beachhead for Russia's destruction. Perhaps cooler, slightly more rational heads will prevail.
Well, certainly it's the case that there is a lot of conflict within the Trump administration and within the wider Republican Party as to which way they're going to go. Every time Trump tries to back away from something, for instance, the Ukraine war in particular, you have Lindsey Graham and others piling out saying we need more stuff to be done against Russia now, etc. But the fact is that they run into the very real limitations of the actual power of the United States, both in military and industrial terms. They can't outproduce the Russians when it comes to war material. They can't supply Ukraine adequately to keep up this level of fighting, which is exactly why Trump is looking to sort of sidle away from the shall we say, a leading role in sustaining the battle, palm it off onto the Europeans, and hope that when the collapse comes, it's not blamed on him. They can't avoid, though, the draw that is the continued attempt to try to do some quote unquote do something about the Chinese. Because if the Chinese succeed in what they are doing, not just domestically, but internationally, and provide or help to provide other nations with a route to industrialization that doesn't involve them being essentially reduced to debt slaves of the US, the British, and the Europeans, then that's the US business model over with, done, finished. And so the attempt to try and find some kind of modus vivendi with the Chinese or the Russians is never going to work, precisely because both of these countries, but particularly China, does represent an existential threat to the entire US-led bloc. Now, Trump will find that out in due time, and is finding it out, I would argue, now, because the Chinese and the Russians have an objective interest in making sure that Venezuela is secured, for instance. So even if they did tilt towards purely hemispheric action, they'll find that Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and others will find natural partners with China and Russia in order to economically develop themselves and to secure themselves. So even if they did carry out this pivot to hemispheric operations only, they would also find that the Russians and the Chinese would be active in the US's backyard, so to speak. So there's an awful lot of futility going on, but what it reflects, I think, is the growing realization that they can't continue in the same old way, but nor does anybody in the US policy-making sphere know any other way to actually behave. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out inside the Washington and London corridors of perfidiousness, shall we say. But talking of US decline, collapse, chaos enveloping us, etc., we should, of course, turn to another symptom of decline, which is, of course, political assassinations and the games therein. And it has been a story which dominates British and European media this week, that is, of course, coming from the United States and relates to the apparent assassination of the US, I would say, paid spokesman for oligarchic interests, a certain Charlie Kirk, who was shot dead at a college campus in Utah earlier this week via being shot in the neck. So far, the FBI, that known agency, that agency known very well for honest and upright law enforcement, and certainly not an agency which is associated with almost 100+ years of systematic cover-ups, domestic political repression, and ties to organized crime. So far, they haven't arrested anybody, though they are seeking an apparent suspect. But that's not the really interesting thing about this story so far. The interesting thing about it is much more related to the fact that the way in which this death is being used, I would say, is the more interesting thing. With the U.S. vice president escorting Kirk's coffin on Air Force Two, with calls for him to be lain in state inside the houses of Congress, with all kinds of orchestrated, what I would say, tweet-based hysterics coming out from various people calling for civil war now inside the United States, all of which, rather unsurprisingly, all look like they came off the same form tweet, pre-written by somebody. So clearly something is going on, and the death of this guy is being used by various different forces inside the United States and potentially internationally to justify something. The something in question, I would say, is going to be an attempt by the Trump administration to further their agenda of domestic political repression. Now, it should be noted that whoever was in office is going to be pursuing the same agenda. It wouldn't matter if the election had been won by the Democrats. The same agenda would be being pursued, because it's an agenda of the U.S. ruling class, which is to stamp out any real dissent inside the United States and make sure that the population is pushed into supporting the two parties of the U.S. oligarchy, mainly the Democrats and the Republicans. So that's my initial analysis of this. It's the death itself is not as interesting or significant as what they're going to try and do with it. And what they're going to try and do with it is largely unrelated to what the man was in life, which is a paid spokesman for a corporate-run, essentially US think tank. And he'll be transformed into some sort of martyr figure for American reactionaries afterwards. But Kit, what's your analysis of this rather strange situation inside the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't have all of the facts, to say the least, about what happened. It's all very murky. There were two individuals who were arrested and then promptly released from custody when it was allegedly determined that they had nothing to do with this. It looks like quite a professional hit, but I think that the thing that really makes my antenna twitch furiously is yes, I mean, we now have on screen Vice President J.D. Vance carrying Charlie Kirk's coffin from Air Force Two, which is the official vice president's private jet. And you just had up on screen as well a call for Charlie Kirk to lie in state in the US Capitol Rotunda. What next? Charlie Kirk gets chiseled into Mount Rushmore. The Charlie Act is passed, which allows for warrantless home searches and wiretapping and detention without trial. It's clearly being weaponized and exploited, and boy, does the response of so many people suggest this is highly coordinated. The thing that really, got my antenna twitching is the blanket coverage this is getting outside of the US. Now, Turning Point USA is it advocates for conservatism in high schools and colleges and universities in the US. And it has a database of professors who espouse leftist dogma and that all this sort of kind of McCarthyite rubbish. Outside of the US, I can't imagine that very many people have heard of him. I mean, I do follow US politics, but I mean, he hadn't particularly cropped up on my radar. Beyond the fact that he was this kind of prominent and loud conservative commentator, of which America is particularly good at producing, particularly when there is, Koch brothers money behind them. The BBC, their front page in the immediate aftermath of his shooting was drowning in stories about Charlie Kirk and the shooting. We have the statement here from Keir Starmer. My thoughts this evening are with the loved ones of Charlie Kirk. How many British citizens have ever heard of him? I would imagine it's within the margin of error. Like, why is there this insane level of attention being given to a marginal? And he wasn't even a politician. He wasn't involved in electoral politics, at least on a personal direct level. It is really, really, really bizarre, and quite clearly, talking points and key messages have been widely circulated. I gather from comrades who live in Europe, who are based in Australia and New Zealand, that their media is giving this blanket coverage. And it's like, oh, right, well, shock horror, an American citizen, in a country known for political violence, drowning in legally and illegally owned guns, get shot. I mean, where's the news value in that story for an average German citizen? It's not there. And I think that, yes, as you say, this is 100% going to be used to justify domestic crackdowns. I have spoken to several American comrades and collaborators who are very worried about a potential coming crackdown on them and groups with which they're associated, it is evidently meant to be. We are being told that this is highly significant. And yes, there was a someone I think it'd be good to get it up on screen. Someone collated all of these tweets by different figures, which state that this is the beginning of civil war. This is like the Reichstag fire. I've seen some analogies to the murder of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, which kickstarted World War One. There are clearly people who are determined to exploit this for maximum political gain. And things could get very nasty as a result.
Well, yes, and I would say that the level of repression inside the United States has been going up and up and up for many, many years, as it has been in Britain. There is a very determined group inside the United States of well-funded reactionaries who are particularly determined to snuff out the pro-Palestine movement. Same is true in Britain. And if they could use this to go after pro or Palestine solidarity activism, then they'll certainly do that. I would say more broadly, I mean, there's been an obsession amongst, I would say, well-paid hysterics of the left and the right for years in the United States about a coming civil war. There's been speculation about it as far back as I remember it being talked about in the 90s. And many people, including those you can see on screen here who are tweeting hysterically about this, are sort of nominally, excited about this. I don't think they'd be the ones doing any of the fighting now. But I want to just take a moment to say that when civil wars emerge, they emerge out of either the collapse of an old system and a struggle for power amongst various different groups to replace it, or replace like the old system with a new one that will be run by one group or another. Or it's when like one system is being overcome by a newer one and it seeks to violently resist its demise. That's the English Civil War, for instance. That's the American Civil War in terms of like the power of industrial capitalist bourgeoisie running into conflict with the backward rural slavocracy of the South. Of course, the slavocracy of the South being manipulated by the British, but that's another story. But the two running into conflict with each other when the ruling class effectively split between the more modern industrialists and the backward slavocracy. There's no such conflict in the U.S. right now. The U.S. ruling class is very much unified around the need to continue business as usual. There is no rising class that unfortunately, which could overthrow them at this stage. What there is disintegration, sort of disintegration and decay, and particularly disintegration in the political system, a loss of power of the established media organizations, shall we say, great doubt being sowed in the minds of the U.S. population as to the legitimacy of the system. And I would argue that what the Civil War talk and what the talk of the Democrats as being sponsors of terrorism is really about, and I mean really, I doubt that people like dumbos like Jesse Waters understand this, but what it's really about is re-legitimizing both political parties. The Republicans in the sense that and the MAGA Republicans in the sense that they will claim to be the only thing standing in the way of the evil leftists turning America into, whatever they're saying these days, an Islamic republic or something. And that you need to back if you're a patriotic American, you need to stop the terrorism, etc., of the left. And the only way to do it is by voting Republican in the upcoming midterm elections, etc. And also by my book. The Democrats will use it in the same way, which is the Democrats will say to their voting base or potential voting base, which is very disillusioned with them, and their Democratic Party is loathed in a lot of places for being a miserable bunch of absolute, shall we say, lying bastards who routinely lead people up the garden path and leave them there. They will use this to try and re-legitimize themselves by saying that the evil Republicans are coming for you. We are your only defense. The only defense against the McCarthyism Mark II or civil war coming down the pipeline is by voting Democrat at the next election. Look at all these scary influencers online saying they're going to come for you. The only way to do it is to make sure that you vote for Gavin Newsom at the next presidential election, etc., etc. What all of this does, all this sort of hysterical coverage from right and left-wing figures, but it seeks to push people down into support for the traditional parties of oligarchy. That's what it seeks to do, and the fact that so many people go along with this shows that how dumb and oblivious a lot of the US population, particularly in the media class, are as to what's going on. Either that or they know full well what's going on and choose to make a career out of joining in with it, which is the more likely outcome. Either way,
Yeah.
this is a psychological operation. The whole symbolism of turning this guy into the late Mr. Kirk into a martyr for like the American right is an operation that is being conducted by people who know exactly what they're doing, even if the dummies on Twitter don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's another aspect to this, which my friend and colleague sum this up very, very neatly in a post on Twitter or X, which is that, yeah, like Charlie Kirk for most of the 21st century Holocaust in Gaza has not been critical of Israel, quite the reverse. But recently, he seemed to change course. And Jeremy notes, after watching recent clips of Charlie Kirk, I've seen him suggest there was a military stand-down order on October 7th, which there was, accused Israel of ethnically cleansing Gaza, claimed that he doesn't have the freedom to criticize Israel, and invited Dave Smith, a well-known anti-Zionist, to speak at the country's biggest conservative youth event. Now, Donald Trump has openly admitted that the US support for Israel is damaging the Republican Party's support with younger voters, because even the most conservative young Americans are opposed to what Israel is doing, even if they, it might not come from some sincere and heartfelt sympathy for the Palestinians. That like. Israel's conduct, genocidal conduct, is a very serious problem, and by platforming or voicing criticism of Israel, Kirk was exposing young American conservatives to those perspectives, which is a pretty big audience. So I mean, I'm not suggesting necessarily that it was the Israelis what done it, but I do think that he was creating a lot of trouble for himself, and there are some people who have some of his associates have claimed that he said in the lead up to his death that he was frightened of Israel, and worried about potential consequences for not being effusively supportive of what they're doing in Gaza. So it's like, I mean, I think it's again, we don't have the full facts on this, and it would be wrong to engage in speculation too much. But him getting rubbed out, it serves a wide variety of purposes, and as you say, both wings, which are of the US power structure, which are in any event effectively indivisible, are making political capital out of this, and it is also and in the process, problematic criticism of a policy they both parties support, no matter the rhetoric of of some Democrats on this. His death solves a lot of problems, and it also gives the Trump administration, which is massively ramping up recruitment for ICE and is deploying the National Guard to the streets of DC because allegedly, the far left are so dangerous, and we're in this civil war type. We're on the brink of civil war. It will be used for further repression. The security and intelligence services will no doubt be given bigger budgets and more powers. And yes, as you say, the Democrats will say, well, this is fascism emerging in America, and you should vote for us because, we'll get someone who says fluffy, nice sounding things in again. If you vote for us, and you can feel better about living in the headquarters of the global American empire. So it's very murky. The preponderant interest by the media is certain in this is extremely suspicious, and there does appear to be a very high degree of coordination of messaging across the Western world on this. I think that the side of many European lawmakers holding a minute's silence in the European Parliament for Charlie Kirk, it speaks volumes as well about the how utterly vassalized, if that's even a word, I've just coined it, Europe is at this point. It is a colonial extension of the US, and a particularly servile and questioning one, which is saying something.
Yes, well, as you've seen on the screen there, that is a very much a living and breathing example of just how low the Europeans have sunk. And none of these people should be treated with any respect or taken particularly seriously, who are engaging in ridiculous public acts of self-debasement like that. Just as the tweeting from Starmer and Yvette Cooper about Kirk's death was not about Kirk himself. It was about groveling to Trump and trying to influence Trump. That's what that was about. And also the reason why you get so much coverage of every single thing that happens in the United States is partly because the people who run the media organizations in Britain have this sort of mentality that all of the British establishment has, or certainly the media establishment has, which is that a lot of them devoutly wish that they were actually American citizens themselves. Because they know, just as Churchill did, by the way, and when he expressed the view that he wished he was American, that the power to actually shape the world, maybe not these days, but at least in the previous generation, lay within Washington, D.C. and New York, did not lie necessarily within London anymore, unless London could manipulate other actors to do their work for them, which is what we specialize in covering here for you. And a lot of the media operators in this country, I've met some of these people in their past lives. I met some of the reporters when they were students, when I was a student, and these people have a craven worship of all forms of power. And so when it comes to the United States, they see that as the greatest, not only the greatest country on earth, but the thing that they want to pledge their allegiance to because of its role as the imperial hegemon. And that's the reason why you get part of the reason why you get such ridiculous coverage. But we will track this as we go on through the unfolding drama of the upcoming weeks. We'll also track the inevitable return of Peter Mandelson when he makes his latest undead-like appearance on camera. But until next time, thank you everybody for tuning in, and be sure to come back to us for upcoming specials on cultural influencing organizations, amongst other things. But until then, from an undisclosed location in Scotland, it's goodbye from me.
And from an undisclosed location in the future Yugoslavia, it's goodbye from me. God bless you guys. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks for joining us again. Take care.